Welcome to Elysium Theatre Company's Durham Shakespeare Festival podcast 2023, recorded with Durham University to mark the 400th anniversary of the publication of the First Folio. We present interviews with some of the leading Shakespearean actors and scholars in the UK. I'm Jake Murray, Artistic Director of Elysium Theatre Company, and with me is actor of stage and screen, Paterson Joseph. Paterson, thank you for doing this. Tell us a little about yourself, how you became an actor, and how you discovered Shakespeare.
Thanks, Jake. This is a pleasure. I love this subject. I think that most people would maybe presume, who've ever seen me do Shakespeare or heard me doing Shakespeare, that I've always lived with Shakespeare somehow, that I come from that world where Shakespeare's just on the shelf. Everybody's doing it. I wasn't that guy. So I grew up in 60s London, born in Park Royal, northwest London. Parents from St. Lucia in the Caribbean. They spoke Creole, St. Lucian Creole, and they stopped speaking that language to me when I was 3. I only found out when I was about 33. And it was a bit of a surprise because I remembered searching for that language. I remember asking my mum about objects in the house and naming them, and her being very annoyed and me stopping asking her. This was preschool. I remember saying once in school that, we had Sunday lunch with rice and peas and chicken, salad with lettuce, tomato and cucumber, and not understanding even why cucumber came out of my mouth. So I sort of word obsessed, and I have always been word obsessed. And I feel like I learnt most of, the way I speak, even before drama came into my life, the way I thought and spoke. I think I garnered a lot of that from, obviously, siblings. I had siblings who were slightly older, but also from radio and television, and imitating what I saw. Often I would just imitate strange newscasters, and I'd sit there. There was a magazine program called The World. What was it called? Some Weekend World, and it was like a politics magazine program. And I'd sit there, imitating the procurator fiscal or the chancellor of the exchequer, and just imitate them. So language was always, I was always fascinated by it. And as the son of an immigrant, I suppose my antennae was really sharp about what words meant, but what the way somebody said it meant. The difference between the two was really clear to me. There was a guy who used to run a corner shop in Wilson Green. I remember going in there, and quite often he would say, all right, Bonzo. And I didn't know at 6 or 7 what he meant. It sounded chirpy, but there was something weird about it that made me think, I don't know. I don't really think he's being friendly. Something weird's going on. And it wasn't until years later where I saw that there was a Cary Grant film called Bedtime for Bonzo, which I think was about a monkey. And it struck me then that there is a kind of sensitivity that you can develop, especially if English is not your absolute first language. That means that you're hypersensitive to it. So anyway, I wanted to always have a grasp of language, and I did a lot of reading when I was at school, not curriculum reading, because I bunked off a lot, played truant a hell of a lot from the age of about 13. But I just go off to the library, or I'd walk to Brent Cross, the shopping centre, and go into W.H. Smith and read the new books. That was my sort of weird rebellion. I'd go in and do the register in my sinkhole school in Harlesden, northwest London, and then I'd just walk out. But I hid in the library and hid at W.H. Smith's, and I read and I read and I read. And I read eclectically, or chaotically, you might say. Mum had aspirationally bought a bunch of books, probably from the actor David Calder, who later told me that actors would always go around with encyclopedias and books seemingly bound in, leather and embossed in gold, but they were just, cardboard that looked quite good. People would just buy box sets of these things. And my mum had a bunch of these, and they were short stories by Oscar Wilde, Guy de Maupassant in translation, John Goldsworthy's Forsyte Saga, all sorts of stuff. And I read all of that, and a bunch of Mills and Boon, which for the younger people is like romantic short novels, pulp fiction. But anything, Agatha Christie's, I read most of them before I was out of my teens. So words, and my obsession with words linked with short story, getting into acting, and particularly Shakespeare. And I suppose my introduction to Shakespeare was strange because I'd never really heard it. I'd heard about Shakespeare. I'd read, not read any Shakespeare, but I'd certainly could read, if you like, from the world that he was a special person, special writer in the English language. And so I remember being involved with the National Youth Theatre, as in auditioning for, by accident, because a mate of mine was doing it. So I thought, oh, I'll just do it. Sounds like it might be fun. I'd never heard of the National Youth Theatre or even what it was. I'd never been to the theatre. And then Tony pulled out, but I had already booked it, so I had to do it. So I remember going to the history teacher because I was 14. I didn't take, of course not, didn't take drama or whatever as an option, or even English literature as an option. Just didn't think these things were for me. And anyway, the history teacher said, an audition is very simple. All you do is just take from this book and you do an audition piece. And I barely even knew what she was talking about, but it had to be 2 minutes long, whatever. She handed me The Merchant of Venice. And I took it home and I opened it up and I thought, well, it's a play, so I'm meant to be reading it out loud. So I was quite a mumbler and a shy child, quite timid. And I think that comes from being bilingual, but having that other language sort of oppressed in you. I've read a lot about it. My son is bilingual, French and English. And if you don't do that, the language can become very sort of squeezed and a bit diminished and a little confused, and you lose a bit of confidence in speaking, especially public speaking. So I would always, people would ask me what your name is, and I go, and they go, what? And the last thing you want to do when you're shy is have somebody ask you to repeat something. So here I am in my room, and I open up this book, and there's a whole preface, as you know, most of these things that are talking about the book and talking about it. I thought, this looks really boring, so I just skipped to the bit where it looked like the actual characters were talking. I don't even think I might have read the dramatis personae at the beginning, the cast list. I don't know. Anyway, I started in, and I just remember opening my mouth, and because plays are meant to be read out loud, aren't they? And going, in sooth, I know not why I am so sad. It wearies me, you say it wearies you. How I caught it, found it, or came by it, what stuff 'tis made of, whereof it is born, I am to learn. And such a want wit sadness makes of me that I have much ado to know myself. I remember thinking, I get that. I get that. He's really sad, he's depressed, he doesn't know why, and he can't explain it. Oh, okay, I get that. And then I read through, and I remember hitting on this speech of Shylock's, and it just popped out like, I'm definitely doing this one, because it felt like me. Signor Antonio, many a time and oft in the Rialto, you have rated me about my monies and my usances. Still have I borne it with a patient shrug, for sufferance is the badge of all our tribe. Everything about that speech, the beginning of that speech was like, oh, he's going to say something maybe vicious to him. And the way he expresses himself, you call me misbeliever, cutthroat, dog, and spit upon my Jewish gabardine, and all for that which is mine own. Then it now appears you need my help. Go to. Then you come to me and you say, Shylock, we would have monies. You say so. You. And I mean, so much of it was like deeply angry, but incredibly articulate. And all the rage that I ever felt about people, painting on walls, and nigger go home, wogs out, blacks out, keep Britain white. All of the negative feelings I ever had about the teachers and how they treated us. And of course, now there's a documentary, BBC documentary, to legitimize what we absolutely knew was true, that we were treated as educationally subnormal, those of us who were African Caribbean. And all of that rage just distilled in this man's speech. Should I not say, hath a dog money? Is it possible a cur can lend 3,000 ducats, or shall I bend low? And in a bondsman's key, with bated breath, whispering humbleness, say this: fair sir, you spit on me on Wednesday last. You spurned me such a day. Another time, you called me dog. And for these courtesies, I'll lend you thus much money. Oh, I mean, I could feel the power of saying that as a 14-year-old and going, well, this is not me speaking, this is Shakespeare, but I'm really allowing myself to feel his feelings. And that's the speech I did. And I was way too shy, I think, to get in. I don't think the acting could have been bad. It was certainly rooted, but I didn't get in. I could take about that as well, that strange crossover from working class son of immigrant community to, friendly, happy chap, middle class white man at the National Youth Theatre talking to me. It was such a strange cultural exchange. He didn't get me, and I definitely didn't get him. There was no anger. It was just, I was completely discombobulated by the whole experience. And it stayed as a seed in the back of my head. Two things stayed as a seed. One, I really loved being that other person and being able to express things that I wasn't really allowed to express so articulately. To have those words in my mouth felt very powerful. And then the other thing was Shakespeare. Shakespeare is not hieroglyphs. Shakespeare, if I can understand them, and if I have might need a dictionary or whatever, but for some of the words, but actually it doesn't really matter. It's like I could get the feelings. I know what the feelings were, and I know what the ideas were behind most of the feelings I'm reading in this book. And I never forgot that. So Shakespeare never held any fear for me, and I didn't either have any hatred for him. And when I meet people who have studied him or who knew him in terms of, when they were kids, they had to recite bits or hear it read at school or whatever, there's a real hatred of it. And I don't even mean they're passive about it, hate it, because it came to them in the wrong way, as far as I'm concerned. So that's my story of how I encountered Shakespeare, what he meant to me, I suppose, and why I think he is a great playwright. It's not because I've been told or because I've done English literature degree. It's because that's how he hit me.
Well, The Merchant of Venice is a fairly extraordinary way in. I studied that at school, having a Jewish father and a mother from a Catholic background. She wasn't Catholic. The play's always obsessed me. And I know exactly what you mean about how compelling Shylock is. And I've never understood the idea that Shylock, the traditional idea is that Shylock is the villain, that the role is anti-Semitic, the way that the Jewish character is portrayed. Me, there is a righteousness to him. The anger is rooted in abuse that he's taken. And so much of, I would add to what you were saying about the anger and the articulacy, a humanity that I think, unless in some sense you've suffered the wrongs that he's suffered, whether you're Afro-Caribbean or white or Jewish or whatever, you perhaps don't understand where that is coming from. And I think the other thing you highlight is just how contemporary those plays are. And as you say, when you can make that human connection, your emotional connection with them, they suddenly burn as if they were written yesterday.
Yeah. I mean, I think that about Othello too, the argument being mooted these days is that, it's a racist trope. The black man fooled by the white man, black man not being smart enough to outwit a cunning white man. But I think that's very shallow. I think that's a very shallow reading. And if you're in the inside of it, and I played him once for your father, in fact, at the Royal Exchange, resisted it for many years. I was 40 when I played him. I didn't want to do it. And the reason I didn't want to do it is because I thought, that it wasn't the best part, that the best part was Iago, because he's got all the words, but he's also got all the charm and he can speak to the audience. And what I discovered being inside it is two things. One is, it's very clear why Othello is undermined by the idea that Desdemona is unfaithful to him. He's a man of a certain age. He's never been in love before. He feels incredibly vulnerable. He doesn't know what's going on or what's happening to him. The feelings are not under his control, where everything else in his life, after he freed himself from slavery, from capture, it has been in his control. He is the general at the top of the biggest superpower, military superpower in the world at that point, but he's the only black person around. He feels incredibly isolated for many reasons, and then he falls in love with a young girl who sees him in a very pure way And that's overwhelming for him and changes him. He comes from a culture that is much more linear and has more ideas of right and wrong, stronger ideas, and purer ideas of right and wrong, of righteousness and sin, than the Western world, which is already being shaped and changed by the ideas of philosophy. And here's Iago with his European, and you can put it in inverted commas, sophistication, because I think it's a rather negative sophistication that Shakespeare presents. And you look at the purity of Othello's actions, and you can see, and his mind and where he's coming from, how much of a disadvantage he's at, not because he's black, but because he's culturally different. And then you see the biggest thing for me is, what does he say when he's first undermined about Desdemona's faithfulness? The very first thing he says is so contemporary, as you said, and it is this. He says, when Iago leaves, happily for I am black. And it's just there as a sort of first half line left really for the audience. And in the exchange, you could feel it, the audience going, he said it. And it's got to be, it's that's what it is. It's because but that actually, what Othello means is, the reason she is being unfaithful to me and probably will not love me forever is because of the color of my skin. And for him to articulate that to us is for us to know that he's fully aware of who he is, where he is. And that should alleviate any feelings that this man is somehow a kind of bovine figure who has no idea what's going on. He knows precisely what's going on.
He's almost too aware and intelligent and sensitive and, again, humane. The vulnerability he feels, which is very different from being a warrior on a battlefield. That thing of being wounded in the heart is where he's weakest. You bring up so many fascinating things. I remember doing a workshop on Othello in Manchester when I was working there, and someone at the back going, I've never understood this play. It's ridiculous. Why is he so jealous? I mean, the insecurity is ridiculous. And I remember saying, have you never been with someone and thought they were interested in betraying you, or someone out, they were flirting too much with someone? Have you never felt jealousy? And that person went completely silent. And there's something about section jealousy that people don't like to admit to. And yet I think it's very, very common.
Yeah. I mean, I've felt it once in my life, and it totally irrational. And I would say I fancied myself as being pretty super rational. I mean, I wasn't, so I can see that now, and that everything I thought, was surely true. But actually, it is a monster, and a monster as in it has no coate reason. It just comes at you, and you can try and figure your way out of it and maybe talk your way out of it with someone, but that's about your only way out, because it's just in you like a virus. But the fact that Othello is this vulnerable person who is the titled hero, the fact that at the end it is a tragedy, tells you also everything about how Shakespeare was intending it to be. He could easily have mocked the man to the point where we are really super unsure about what happens at the end and why he did what he did. But we know exactly why he did what he did. One who loved not wisely, but too well. And he says, one who, though unused to the melting mood, drops tears as fast as the Arabian trees their medicinable gum. I am not an emotional man, but look at me. I'm melting in tears. I have been emotionally put through the mangle, and I'm not myself. And Iago, when they asked, why did you do it? Says, don't ask me. He doesn't know why he did it. He doesn't deeply know, because he's not a deep character. And Shakespeare cheats the Iago actor, actually, in the end, into thinking that they might be the lead in this, but they're not the lead in this. They're simply a catalyst for the tragedy that takes place. And that's an empty role in the end, an empty and unsatisfying role. Sorry, Iago's. unless you do, I mean, and especially when you do the thing that I've seen countless Iagos do, which is mugging for the crowd. So to make it look like honest Iago is no longer a joke, but a Shakespeare joke, but actually sort of insult.
It's very interesting that we're talking here about The Merchant of Venice and Othello, which of course the subtitle for Othello is The Moor of Venice. And you and I have talked about this many times independently, but to me the two plays have always been linked. They were written at different periods in his life. And they both deal with, as you say, a super sophisticated society, the superpower of the time, Venice, which was cosmopolitan, advanced, hugely wealthy. And they're both the plays where there is a minority. There's Othello who's a Moor and there's Shylock who's a Jew. What is so fascinating is that everything you say about Othello is right, because he is a tragic hero. It's called the tragedy of Othello, which means Shakespeare saw Othello as heroic, as great, as important as a figure as Hamlet or Macbeth. That's not a racist perspective. Othello is given a fifth act and Shylock isn't. And as you say, that fifth act is about Othello's journey and the transformation that he goes through. And you also bring up something really interesting. I'm just about to start directing Macbeth in a few weeks for the festival. Is, of course, it's two warriors, Othello and Macbeth, and it's the only two, as far as I'm aware of, marriages at the centre of a Shakespeare play, Othello and Desdemona, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. And in both of them, you've got two heroic warriors who are completely undone by their inability to emotionally handle a marriage. I mean, that actually the ability to be strong in battle is not the same as navigating the heart, navigating love, navigating vulnerability. And I think you've given me a huge insight there. And I think that's the power, isn't it? Is that Othello, part of the point of the play is Shakespeare wants us to see Othello as a universal figure.
I believe so. I think the other thing that I've run across, Jake, is people's ignorance of the demographics of Britain at the time that Shakespeare's writing. So here's a hint at what could have been going on. Two hints, in fact. One is in the Tudor court, I mean specifically Henry VIII, but actually Henry VII too, there were black members of that court who were musicians and possibly also servants. But we know that they were musicians because they're on the roster. They're on the household roster. And there's a famous guy in Henry VIII's court, might well have been Henry VII's too, but certainly when Catherine of Aragon came, she brought black musicians with her because the courts of the European continental kings and queens had black musicians in them. John Blanc is in the famous tapestry called the Cloth of Gold tapestry, which was celebrating the birth of the not very long-lived Prince Arthur, Henry's son. And in this tapestry, you see John Blanc depicted with his blackface, and you look in the archive and you see him paid for his work, well paid, and he's there for years. We know very little about him, but he clearly lived a life in Britain, and that was in Henry's time. In Queen Elizabeth I's time, Shakespeare's queen, you have a decree constructed by William Cecil, her privy councillor, and other figures, which stated that Her Majesty, understanding that there are of late diverse blackamoors brought into the realm, of which kind of people there are already here too many, Her Majesty, therefore, requires that these people be sent forth of the land and transported out of the realm. And so the plan was to charter a boat to take them to Spain, and sold off with this dodgy captain who was going to sell them into slavery. But the decree was never signed. But what is extraordinary is the economy was tanking at that point. And so the excuse of sending some foreigners away with such an old playbook was given. And though she never signed it for whatever reason, if I say it in any context, if I used to say in my monodrama about Ignatius Sancho, that was the weapon, as an African time, used as a weapon of self-defense. Because if there were enough black people to write that decree, it tells you that in the Elizabethan world, it was very possible that Shakespeare came across black people. Yeah, and they would have been, some of them would have been certainly free, and sailors, some who would have worked for the sort of proto-British Navy. They would have been servants. They would have been musicians. So they're there. They are there in London. It's just that we've never seen it depicted in any context. A bit like my Sancho story in the 18th century, where I'm getting people going, "Wow, I didn't know there were any black people before 1948," and post-war Britain. Well, how would you know if you've never seen it depicted in any way that isn't just Bridgerton cartoon, if in any real way? So that's also the problem. When people think about Othello, they think about a white man in isolation who doesn't know anything about black people writing about black people. This is totally ignorant of the demographic of the major cities in particular.
Well, equally, I mean, the other thing we forget is that as the Queen's playwright, as it were, he would have encountered ambassadors, princes, people coming from Northern Africa, Arabia, and also we forget that this was the time when Britain was becoming a maritime power. It was the hub of trade to the whole world, and so London would have met people from India, from the Middle East, from Russia, and London itself. You went down to the docks. It was incredibly cosmopolitan. The rest of Britain may well have been completely ignorant of people from other countries, but certainly it would have been incredibly vibrant, I think.
Yeah, all the port cities would have been Bristol, would have been Southampton, and certainly would have been Liverpool. All of the dock cities, and I'm only thinking of mainly the West Coast, but I'm sure the Eastern Coast as well, Essex Coast. They would have been people on board those ships who would have been coming from all points of the maritime world. So to think of him as being an ignorant white man writing ignorantly about black people is you have to put that aside, because he's such a curious person that I suspect, more than suspect, that he would have rubbed shoulders with everybody. I mean, it would have been a Dickensian and more immersion into other cultures and worlds that are far from the Warwickshire schoolboy.
Even starting with Two Gentlemen of Verona, he's always interested in the outsider and the underdog. And even looking at Aaron the Moor in Titus Andronicus, he pleads that for equality of black people and white people. That when Aaron tries to protect his child, it's extraordinary for me. Is the last play I did was The Island by Athol Fugard, John Carney, and Winston Schoner, and of course, at the heart of Othello is a marriage between a black man and a white woman, which was illegal in South Africa, and it couldn't be represented on stage with a black actor and a white actress. And when John Carney said that I think John Carney was the first black actor to play Othello who was able to kiss a white Desdemona on a South African stage. That makes you aware of the radicalism of the play, the visionary quality of it, that he wanted this to happen.
It didn't happen in Hollywood forever, and it was a big deal when it did happen. Jungle Fever, which was a film that Spike Lee made in the early 90s, was depicting a mixed black-white relationship. And it was a big deal in the 1990s. And the idea that a black person could be with a white person on stage or on screen was a massive deal. I mean, when Paul Robeson in the middle of the 20th century played Othello, there was outrage at him kissing Peggy Ashcroft. Outrage. And, we know that they were actually doing more than just kissing on stage. They were having a full-on fiery relationship. But the reality of seeing that on stage shocked many of these critics, and we always claim, I think a lot of people claim that Britain never had racism in the way that America did, but I beg to not only differ, but to tell you that was not true. We also had our color bars too. So this is very, it's good for us to set the scene when we want to look at playwrights in retrospect and try to somehow paint them with a 21st century brush, because that's unfair. And in 150 years' time, when we find that everything we're saying is just out of whack, we'd hope that somebody would look at us with some sympathy and say, well, this is what we knew now. This is what we knew then. and see the difference and to set the scene. You know, I've had this with other playwrights in my life as well, people claiming them to be racist, but actually they weren't. They were simply people of their time. And yes, some of the tropes that they used definitely could be described as racist. Was that their intent? No. But I think that with Shakespeare, it's easy to look at him as a propagandist. But for him, he wasn't doing propaganda. For him, he was just trying to write plays about human beings, which I think is why he survived, not because of the propaganda machine.
I think that's a really good distinction to make, is that Shakespeare was writing plays, and in many ways, those plays are still extraordinary, progressive in their vision of gender, of race, of masculinity and femininity. But what he's been used to reinforce, he had no control over. What's so fascinating is here we are 400 years later, and the right claim that he's one of them, the left claim he's one of them, and he can't be both. Do you know what I mean? It's still being argued over, and I think it's still exciting, radical stuff. Just summing up this fascinating conversation, is there anything you want to say about, just very briefly, we've talked about the amazing power of those two plays. What's the experience as an actor of playing Shakespeare for you?
It is clear to me, and I'm trying to think if somebody told me this or if this is something I found out, and it's hard now, the older I get, it's hard to dissect this idea, but I think I do believe it, that Shakespeare is, say, like if you imagine yourself as a sort of high-end car. I know nothing about cars, so probably this is going to fail as an analogy. But if you're a high-end car, you know, a sports performance car, and you trundle along in traffic, that's fine, but it's probably not going to do the engine a lot of good over the long term. And I think that is what it's like doing most playwrights stuff, is that it's good, it's all good stuff, all good roads, if you like, but they don't really allow you to go, I'm going to put my foot down and go to the limits of how much control I have over this huge engine. And the huge engine is the massive emotions that you're being asked to sustain for 2 hours. The monumental shift, the transformation that you're going to go through in the 2 hours when you start playing in the Shakespeare production. That there is so much going on physically, mentally, and probably at a biological level, that by the time you finished it, you are wrung out and usually quite exhilarated, but it's because you've been through something. Actors who played Hamlet have told me that, gosh, and I feel this too in other roles in Shakespeare, where you go, I'm exhausted, I don't have anything, and I've got to do this journey. God, how am I gonna? And then you start on the road, and by the time you finish, it's almost like I didn't even know what happened there. And there is a kind of mountain that you have to climb, and there, emotionally, the limit of believability, the limit of your emotional capacity, your intellectual breadth, everything is challenged, and everything is asked to be turned up to 11 without being over the top. It's really hard. It's really, really hard. It's hard to be it's easy to be over the top, and it's easy to underplay. So easy to underplay, where none of the power of what you're doing comes through, really. All the poetry, but none of the power. And that's Shakespeare for me. And that's to me why he is acting boot camp. He makes you take yourself to places that no other playwright will ever ask you to go to, unless we have a sea change and people want bigger dramas and bigger emotions and bigger transformations. Because that I don't see that in most of the work that I see. You know, transformation is minimal, and whereas, you know, Othello starts the play in one way and ends in another. Shylock starts the play in one way, ends in another. Hamlet starts the play as one person, ends as a completely different person. You know, Viola starts as one person, she ends as another person. Juliet starts as one person, ends in another. None of these characters, Cleopatra, who, even though she's already a middle-aged woman, starts the play as one person and ends as another. None of these characters are unscathed by what they go through, and they all have to climb this huge, emotional, believable mountain. And yeah, that's Shakespeare. He is the biggest test of any actor.
Wonderful. And to finish up with, is there anything you'd like to say to a young actor or a young person reading Shakespeare for the first time? as they start out? Anything for them to take away?
Yeah, don't be afraid to not understand, and allow the words, the rhythm of the words, and whatever sense you get from it, reading it without a dictionary, just sit down and read it out loud to yourself, all the parts if you want, and just see what you get from that first reading. And if it's like, this is hieroglyphs, I don't understand it, then fair enough. Pick up a copy of C.T. Onion's glossary and go through it word by word if you like. But I would almost guarantee, actually I would guarantee, that if you read a playthrough without any aids at all, you would probably get 60% of it. You'd get the feeling of what's going on for at least 60% of it. And that will never leave you. So that when you do find out more, you'll still remember, like I remember, what it felt like to be Shylock, what it felt like to say, oh, you think I'm just this guy you're going to use? Well, I got news for you. I've been observing you too. And I'll never forget that feeling, no matter how sophisticated a production I'm ever in. I'll always remember that. So first impressions count. And I would say for any young actor approaching Shakespeare, don't be afraid of him. He's written for you. It just needs some translation because it's old language. But if you were a working class kid in an urban setting, black or white, and you speak a certain language that I don't speak, I would have to decipher that too. But if you let me know what's going on by just hearing you, I probably would understand, even though I don't understand all the words and phrases that you're using, that you're angry or that you're happy or that you're feeling something humorous or that you're mocking somebody. I get it. So it's the same thing. And then you can learn later what these actual words mean, which is interesting. But first things first, sit down with it, open it up, read it out loud to yourself and see what comes to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paterson Joseph.
Oh, you're very, very welcome, Jake. Thank you.
That was Paterson Joseph sharing with us his experience of playing Shakespeare. To find out more about the Durham Shakespeare Festival 2023, go to our website, www.elysiumtc.co.uk.